Craig Whittaker there for Calder Valley, a Conservative MP, and Munira Wilson, Twickenham MP and a Liberal Democrat. So, Chi, look, we lost you earlier, so let's come straight to you. Prime Minister a bit irritable there. What did you make of all of that?
Well, I was really, he was irritable, and I was really disappointed that at this time, when we're 10 weeks into lockdown, when we need public confidence in our ability to deal with this horrendous outbreak to be at a maximum. The Prime Minister's issue seemed to be with Keir raising the question of public confidence and trust, and not actually with the fall in public confidence and trust. And the fact that that's, it's partly because he refused to sack Dominic Cummings. I know that from my post bag. I know that from what we're hearing about, people giving excuses for not following lockdown. He didn't address the issues with our test, track and isolate system. He didn't address the issues with the fact that we are not getting, the National Statistics Office says that we're not getting transparent data on how many people we're testing. He didn't address the concerns about people being able to go into isolation and be supported during isolation. So he was more interested in attacking Keir for raising these issues, for scrutinising, than in actually supporting public confidence, which is what we need now.
Yeah, but Chi, let me just come back in, because Keir there said you're misinterpreting scrutiny for attacks. But isn't the danger for the Labour Party and for Keir Starmer that if the public think that he is just, and you are just attacking the government and trying to do them down over their attempted response at coronavirus, that actually that is what's the detriment of the Labour Party, not of the government or to the government?
Beth, we have been very clear, and indeed Keir has been criticised for this. We've been very clear from the start that, firstly, this is not easy. This is difficult. It's a huge challenge. It's a national crisis. But also that we need the government to succeed on this. The consequences are just too catastrophic for our health, and also for our economy. And we're not in March. We're not in April. We're not in May. We are in June now. And we still don't seem to have a coherent, collaborative approach to dealing with this pandemic. And I think I think the public do recognise that. And now we need, the hard questions to be asked and answered. And particularly, isolation, lockdown is not a strategy. Our strategy for dealing with this pandemic has to be about test, track and isolate. And we don't have the data on that. We don't have a world-beating system. We see that in other countries, they are testing at much greater numbers. Greece is opening its borders and testing everyone who comes into that country. And yet we're in the position now that lockdown is being eased without the measures in place that can support that. And I think, public confidence is not being driven by the Labour Party and what Keir is saying. It's being driven by the actions of the Prime Minister, and he needs to take responsibility for that. And I'm really concerned that he is not doing that.
OK, well, let's put that to Craig. I mean, the Prime Minister there criticising Keir Starmer for these endless attacks on public trust. But how much of this has been an own goal by your own Prime Minister? And let's be honest about that. What was your response when you've got your inbox full of people criticising government policy or being uncomfortable with it, and then the Prime Minister just being very negative and literally batting off any criticism as an attack, i.e. you're not even allowed to scrutinise the government anymore? What do you think of that? Is that an own goal?
No, I mean, let's look at what happened here. Keir was incredibly bland. He was wide of the mark. There was no real scrutiny there at all. He could have really taken the Prime Minister to task on a lot of issues there, in-depth scrutiny. He failed miserably on it. And I'm sorry to say, but it just was not the blockbuster premiere that everybody was expecting to see today at all. He missed the mark completely.
But also, I'll just come back before I bring Munira in. Also, the Prime Minister didn't answer the question on what the R rate was. He didn't answer the question on what the alert level was, and he didn't answer the question around some criticism from the Statistics Authority about the way in which the government are measuring and reporting testing, all of which I would argue are pretty substantive policy questions.
Well, I think he actually did answer the one on the current R rate and the level that we're at. He said it's still the same, it's at 4, and the R rate's very, very similar. But that's just an example of,
Craig, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt. We've got an urgent question in the Commons. Sorry about that. Let's listen in.
And the economic impact on aviation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has asked me to respond on his behalf. The COVID-19 crisis has affected every person in the country and every sector of the UK economy, and aviation is essential to that economy. It connects the regions together and it plays a huge part in the UK's future as a global trading nation. That is why the government has responded to the crisis with an unprecedented package of measures. On the 24th of March, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, wrote to the aviation sector, setting out the schemes being made available, including the deferral of VAT payments and the COVID Commercial Finance Facility and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. The Civil Aviation Authority is also working with airlines, airports and ground handlers to provide appropriate flexibility within the regulatory framework. If airlines and airports or other aviation organisations find themselves in trouble because of coronavirus and have exhausted the measures already available to them, the government has been clear that it is prepared to enter into discussions with individual companies seeking bespoke support. We recognise that there remain serious challenges for the aviation sector, despite the measures that have been put in place. It will take time for passenger numbers to recover, and the impact will be felt first and foremost by the sector's employees. The recent announcements about redundancies from companies such as British Airways, Virgin and EasyJet will be very distressing news for employees and their families. These are commercial decisions, and they are decisions which I regret, particularly those companies benefiting from the Job Retention Scheme. The scheme was not designed for taxpayers to fund the wages of employees, only for those companies to put the same staff on notice of redundancy during the furlough period. The government stands ready to support anyone affected with the Department of Work and Pensions, there to help employees identify and access the support that is available. But my department has set up a Restart and Recovery and Engagement Unit to work with the aviation industry on the immediate issues affecting the restart of the sector and its longer-term growth and recovery. As part of this, we have established an Aviation Restart and Recovery Expert Steering Group. The group is formed of representatives from across the sector, including airports, airlines and ground handlers, industry bodies and unions. Mr. Speaker, the sustainable recovery of the aviation sector is a core part of our commitment to global connectivity and growing the UK economy. With airports, airlines and other parts of the aviation sector, we are putting in place the building blocks for recovery. The House will be updated as soon as possible on the next steps.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving aviation workers in your constituency and across the nation the chance to have their voice heard. And thank you, Minister, for being a tireless champion in the sector. This is a hugely...
And that's Hugh Merriman, you can see there. He's a Conservative MP and the chair of the Transport Select Committee there, asking an urgent question about the economic impact on COVID-19 on the aviation sector. You've all seen all of those reports about companies such as British Airways having to lay off thousands of workers, and when will the planes be back really in the sky is a question on everyone's mind. I've still got my panel with me. I've got Chi, Labour MP for Newcastle Central, Craig from Calder Valley, Conservative MP, and Munira from Twickenham, Lib Dem. And Munira, let's come into you because you haven't had a chance to answer anything there. Just back to PMQs, the test and trace system, lots of questions about how effective it is. What did you make of the Prime Minister's answers when pressed by Sir Keir on that matter?
Well, I don't think he was really giving many answers at all, which is why he was so rattled and quite grumpy, really. It's quite clear that the test and trace system, whilst the government is claiming it's operational is not good enough. When we're starting to lift lockdown, testing, tracing and isolating every case to keep people safe is absolutely critical. The fact that they've had their knuckles wrapped because they're not reporting testing figures correctly, and I've had cases in my constituency casework just in the last 24 hours of people who've been waiting 14 days for test results. How can you operate a test and trace system if people are waiting so long? And the fact that they don't even know how many people they're tracing and they can't publish that data. And Dido Harding, who's running the programme, has said herself it won't be up and running until the end of the month. We cannot safely be lifting lockdown without that system in place. And the Prime Minister just seems to think that this is bashing the system. It's not. It's trying to point out that it is quite dangerous to continue without actually having a proper operational system and architecture in place.
So can I just come back on that, Munira? What would you suggest? Would you like the government to pause easing the lockdown until the test and trace system is fully operational?
Yes, it should be doing that. I and my Liberal Democrat colleagues have said all along, since actually very, very early on in the lockdown, when there wasn't any strategy being talked about, I was saying back then, before Easter, that we need to be putting in place a test, trace, isolate strategy. The fact that the government's been very slow in ramping up testing, in ramping up tracing, its app programme is in complete disarray from what I can make out, is the reason why the system isn't properly up and running, and that should be delaying easing lockdown. Not that I want to delay easing lockdown. It's really, really important for the economy and for people's mental health and well-being, for us to be starting to ease lockdown. But we can only do that safely if we've got a test, trace and isolate system in place that's actually working.
OK, and you talked, Munira, about the PM being quite grumpy was your word. Let's have a listen to one of the exchanges between Sir Keir Starmer and the PM just now in the Commons.
We're now 3 weeks on. Some restrictions have been lifted. So can the Prime Minister tell us what's the alert level now and what's the R rate now?
Prime Minister.
He knows perfectly well that the alert level does allow it, and indeed he didn't raise that issue with me when we had a conversation on the telephone, and he knows the reason we've been able to make the progress that we have is that the 5 tests have been fulfilled.
Craig, there we saw the Prime Minister, quite terse exchanges. Do you think he's feeling the pressure? I mean, it must be hugely difficult trying to manage this crisis for him.
Well, I dare say it's hugely difficult for anybody to manage a crisis of this magnitude. That's been clear from all the different things that have gone on. But, I don't think he's grumpy at all. I think he was answering the question that he was being asked. Just let me take up on the test, track and trace. The test, track and trace is a tool in the armory for lifting lockdown in a much bigger way than we already have. The government have always said that once we hit the 5 tests, we would lift, start lifting, easing some of the lockdown measures. The lockdown measures that we've started so far are very, very marginal indeed. We still don't have pubs and social places that are open en masse at all. So I don't quite buy the criticism around that. We've just heard that the Lib Dems want lockdown to stay in place until we get test, track and trace up and running. I think that's an absolute nonsense. We have hit the 5 tests. We have started to ease lockdown in a small way. And of course, the test, track and trace system will help us do that on a much bigger scale.
But do you accept, Craig, that well, point one, that the app, which Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, said was integral to the system. In fact, I believe it was actually in the government's own document that said that the app needed to be ready for the test and trace system to work. They've rowed back on that. Do you accept that there have been sort of, how could I put it, teething issues? The app isn't running. And also, where is the data? I mean, we haven't got any evidence about how the system's actually working. You can see that that does feed into public confidence, can't you?
Well, you know, the system was up and running by the 1st of June. This is a system that's started from literally from a blank piece of paper, which, you know, personally, I don't understand why NHS England wanted to go down that route. We could have quite easily have picked off the shelf some of the other systems available. But that aside, the reality is it started on the 1st of June. With all things that are starting in this way, the more information that you get into that system, the better it becomes. And of course, that will take time. It won't be a fully functioning system from June 1st, but because of the pure nature of the app itself. It will be before the end of the month. And I think that's been fairly widely accepted before we get any reasonable data on there to start looking at local specific flare-ups.
OK, well, look, let me bring in something else that happened in PMQs, which was the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee having said, when asked by MPs about whether he could commit to a 24-hour turnaround target on testing, and those experts putting together track and trace say this is important because it helps you keep a hold of the cases and isolate them. Last week, he said he was forbidden from setting any new targets, and yet in the Commons today, he appeared to actually commit to a target on a 24-hour turnaround. Let's have a quick listen to what he had to say.
We already do 90% of tests turn around within 48 hours. Of the tests conducted at the 199 testing centres and as well as the mobile test centres, they're all done within 24 hours. And I can undertake to him now to get all tests turned around in 24 hours by the end of June, except for difficulties with postal tests or insuperable problems like that.
So there you have it. A week ago, the Prime Minister refusing to commit to a 24-hour test turnaround, and there in the Commons appearing to make what is quite a significant announcement. Chi, what did you make of that? Did you welcome it, or did you think that he was making policy up on the hoof? What was your view?
Well, he did seem. I mean, I think it was again an example of the Prime Minister, winging it. Because I think what he actually said was he was committing to 24 hours for all tests apart from postal tests. And we actually know that the postal test, and that was one of the criticisms of the UK Stats Authority, is that the postal tests are a significant proportion of the daily tests, and that they are being counted when they're sent out instead of when they're actually returned and done. So he didn't clarify. He added to the confusion, and he didn't address. And Craig, in talking about the app is only part of the test, track and isolate system, but it is an important one, which was supposed to be ready for the middle of May, and now we don't have a date for when that's going to be ready. He couldn't give us the data on the testing, and he couldn't address the R. So I think the Prime Minister, when he is on the ropes, he pulls out something from the air, without the evidence and without the justification, and that doesn't contribute to public confidence and understanding. And just to add, we talk about this being developed from a blank sheet of paper, but actually there are thousands of local authority public health officials who could have been integral in getting this going and getting it working, and the government is only just now engaging with them. So that there are many issues which deserve scrutiny, and I'm afraid the Prime Minister just doesn't like it.
Well, I'm afraid in terms of scrutiny, we're out of time. Chi, Craig, Manura, thank you so much for joining us on the panel. Colin Brazier will be with you after the break. Stay tuned for more.